Hi, welcome to the CannaTourism Chronicles, brought to you by the Wrazel Cannabis Broadcasting Network. My name is Barbie Summers, and I'll be your tour guide as we explore the new heights of cannabis tourism. Today, my guest is Jonathan Landis, attorney at law, and his specialty is cannabis business and regulatory law. But first, a word from our kind supporter.
Since 2008, California Lightworks has been guided by a vision focused on the research, design, development, and manufacturing of state-of-the-art commercial LED grow lights and automation equipment for greenhouse and indoor horticulture. By applying the latest advances in high-efficiency, solid-state lighting and controls technology, their team provides worldwide growers new grow lights that deliver clear benefits at a competitive price. Backed by their solid reputation for standing behind their products, California Lightworks also offers industry-leading warranties on all their commercial grow lights. To learn more about California Lightworks, go to californialightworks.com, and to view their current investment opportunity, please go to the investment marketplace at wrazel.com.
Welcome back. I'm here with Jonathan Landis, attorney at law, and we're going to hear all about the laws behind all of the fun things that tourists can do and all of the discussions that go on and are constantly changed and updated, and John stays on top of all of that.
And it's ever changing, and obviously the world we're living in is ever changing. So my front end caveat before we get started is this is filmed when it's filmed, and make sure you stay actively informed because things can and will change, and especially in the world we're in right now.
Exactly. That's why we all need attorneys that stay on top of this 24/7, or well, hopefully you do get some rest. But full disclosure, John is actually my attorney for the productions that I put on through High Dining, and his expertise has been invaluable. And I actually love to have him present at the events, just in case anyone questions the law, or perhaps a police officer finds their way and thinks that we're doing something wrong. You really got to have somebody like John on your side.
I miss having events. Hopefully we'll have them back sooner rather than later.
Yes, and I do want to
Fingers
get
crossed.
into how COVID-19 has changed the event landscape. Not just for cannabis, but it's actually affecting tourism at large. So this is where we talk about the convergence of tourism and cannabis and the uniqueness that these events are, because many don't know that there's a conflict with ABC licenses, that's alcohol. Places cannot sell cannabis and alcohol under the same roof, correct?
Correct, unless they fall within the category of exceptions that we'll discuss, that the limited exception that potentially will be opened, but that's it.
Oh, that's good, because so many events still are alcohol-centric, and it's almost created this division of, well, do you want to go to a cannabis event or an alcohol event? And a lot of people do both, and even though it is something that's highly discouraged for a newbie to blend the two, there are many seasoned people out there, and actually there's the aficionados that love to blend wine and cannabis, and there's a lot of parallels there between that kind of connoisseurship that's really fun to explore too. But let's get back to laws. So current state and federal laws with regards to events and consumption lounges and any kind of thing a tourist might go to, what does a tourist need to know from their perspective?
So first of all, as probably most of the people watching this know, cannabis, even though it is legal to some extent or another in most states at this point, at least medically, is still illegal on the federal level. So with regards to federal law, anything that is cannabis itself, anything that's hemp is sort of more of a gray area, but anything that's cannabis itself is still illegal federally. With regards to state law, that's going to depend state by state until cannabis is federally legalized, or at least decriminalized. It's going to be purely state law and local law that we're going to be looking at, depending on where you are. So I'm going to focus primarily on California, since that's where we're based, and that's where this is being filmed. But if you're in a different state, obviously look at the regulations where you are, because those can and will be very different. With regards to California, California currently requires a license for any type of commercial cannabis activity. Commercial is the operative word. You do not need a license in order to consume, or, to have use your own best judgment. But, in a pre-COVID world, when people were having parties and events, if you're just having your friends over and sharing, you don't need a license for that. But if you're doing anything commercial, you do. There is an events license. So there's a general retail license from the state that you would use if you have a dispensary or a non-storefront delivery. There's also a special events license, which allows you to put on events, like a specific event for a specific time frame at a location, that allows you to have products sold on site and potentially consumed on site. Initially, the restrictions on those were very difficult, as in initially you had to be at either a county fairgrounds or what was called a district agricultural area, I believe. I have no idea what those were until those regulations came out in terms of the district agriculture, but they have loosened that, and now it's more like dispensaries and other types of licenses, where if you have local authorization, as in the city, or if you're unincorporated county you are in allows you to do it at that location, you can do it. So you can get the general events license, and then you apply for a permit for each event you want to do. With regards to consumption lounges, that's going to depend on the municipal laws. If you have a retail license and the municipal area you're in allows on-site consumption, then you can do so. To Barbie's point, there's general restrictions on that with regards to alcohol and also tobacco, as in generally those cannot be, and that's true for dispensaries as well, those cannot be on the same premises. There is proposed legislation that would carve out an exception but alcohol and tobacco would still have to be completely separate, but would allow events that could take place at sites that also sell alcohol, as in, say, a restaurant, for example, that would allow for cannabis potentially to be a cannabis event to be done on site, as long as the cannabis area is separated completely from any area where alcohol is being sold or consumed. One point I would make is this was in progress when COVID hit, and obviously, certainly legally and hopefully generally, people are not doing events right now, and you certainly cannot legally do them right now. So, whether they're cannabis or any other type of event that involves large groups of people gathering. So once hopefully we're in a world where we can have sanctioned events again, I suspect that, especially given the great economic hardships that restaurants, bars, nightclubs, music and entertainment venues, et cetera, are suffering as a result of COVID, I'm hopeful that the state will and local authorities will go out of their way to make things easier for these businesses to get back on their feet and start generating revenue. So I'm hopeful there will be some real policy impetus from state and local authorities to allow events, say with cannabis in these types of locations, to allow these businesses to start generating revenue again when it's safe to do so. And I think that's something that we should all be lobbying for once we are back in a world, hopefully very, in the relatively near future, where events and gatherings are permitted again.
I'm very hopeful of that too. I mean, to be social is part of humanity.
100%. And these are, businesses, law-abiding, good members of their community businesses that are suffering through no fault of their own because of a public health pandemic. And you can ascribe however you feel about our country's response to said pandemic, but obviously we're in a situation where for the last 5 months, we're still dealing with this, and we're still in a place where cases are at a level that we are not able to have these types of events safely, certainly in a state like California. So hopefully as that changes, there will be a lot of effort made to get these businesses back on their feet and allow the business owners and their employees and everyone else to start, making a living again.
Exactly. These are extraordinary times. I've been joking. There's a new era now. BC can also now be before COVID. Because so many of my guests they start sentences with before COVID.
And yeah. Pre-March 11th. That's the day I started, which I think was 5 months, if I remember not exactly 5 months from the day we're filming this. So yeah, it feels like 5 years. But
now, what about private events like a wedding? Are there legalities involved in that?
So it's just going to depend on the venue. Like if you have a private wedding at somebody's home, there's not going to be any specific restrictions. Now there might be. That doesn't always mean that neighbors might not complain or about
there's no
odor,
sales.
noise. Yeah, if there's no sales, it's in a private residence or a privately owned business that's not open to the public, then I would say generally you're not going to need to worry. I'm speaking pre-COVID, just in terms of the specific. Yeah. Now, with regards, just as a caveat, that doesn't mean that for public health reasons that having a large event right now on a private residence is a good idea or legal or safe, because it is not. But outside of that, I would say generally if you're in a privately owned property where the property owner is allowing that to take place generally, and there's no commercial activity taking place, then generally it would be okay. But if it's, say, a restaurant or a winery or a dispensary, a business open to the public, then it is going to be subject to the type of regulations and licensing that any business open to the public would be subject to.
Of course. Now, what about the future? Do you see pending legislation or have any forecasts on how things may change?
I'm hopeful that once, the politics will, but on the state level, and I think we are seeing certainly on the municipal level. I think we're seeing it here where we're filming in Orange County, cities that were previously, on the fence about cannabis, or there was a lot of hesitation or resistance to cannabis, are moving more in the direction of opening up for things like retail, because I think primarily they need, most government authorities are struggling economically right now, as most, we all are, in one extent or another. We're all affected by this, but certainly if you look at the budgets of cities and counties in the state, there's massive shortfalls in terms of tax revenue, and obviously all the additional expenditures for public health that the government is incurring right now. So I think just from a revenue standpoint, they're going to be eager for the revenue, but I'm also hopeful from a policy standpoint that there will be extra effort made to do everything possible again to get these types of businesses that are arguably the most directly, again, everyone is affected by COVID, but like in some ways the most directly affected, say like a nightclub, which is like literally there's no way to make that business something that can operate right now. But when they can, again, to do everything possible for the ones that are still here, to give them extra opportunities to generate more revenue, and hopefully with less administrative and bureaucratic hurdles and costs than they've had previously. Now, that doesn't, obviously, public safety, public health, all those things are still paramount, and there's still obviously going to have to be things in place to protect that, but I am hoping that they'll make things a little bit easier and cheaper for people to do these types of events going forward, if for no other reason than to help out these businesses.
Yes, that's my hope too. These businesses really need our help as soon as we feel safe enough to go out, and Well, that segues into, I wanted to talk about safety, what is considered a low-risk event, and also how can these establishments or event producers and organizers protect themselves.
And this is with regards to currently in
during COVID.
So I would, and this again is going to be very specific to California because every, again, you could argue that this is part of the reason we're in the place we're in, but every state has essentially taken its own wildly different approach to COVID and the level of restrictions. But so I'm going to focus on California because other states may have more or less restrictions, and also obviously this is all subject to change and has changed
any day.
It has changed on a multiple of occasions for various reasons, good and bad, potentially already. But currently, the general impetus from this state and most others, I think, has been, and I think this, to my knowledge, and I am, to be clear, a lawyer, not a scientist, not a public health expert, but from my understanding of the current public health science, this seems to be in line with it, is that outdoor activities are much safer than indoor activities. So I think there's been an impetus to try to move as many things outdoor as possible, as we've seen with outdoor dining being allowed and indoor dining currently not being allowed. Again, that could change at different points, but that's where we're at right now. So I would say generally, with regards to events, follow the local and state rules in terms of what is allowed currently. Also, make sure if you're doing it at a business location, make sure the business owner approves of what you're doing and is aware of the risks. With regards to liability, in addition to, first of all, if you're putting on, say, like an event or doing something that's in violation of local or state laws that exist at the time, you're on your face most likely going to be liable for example, let's say you have a restaurant and you're open for indoor dining even though it's not allowed right now, and then somebody, somebody gets COVID from that and suffers serious health effects, like you're on your face probably going to be liable if they can just prove that you were operating in violation of the law. But outside of that, I would say the best thing to do with regards to activities that may be legal, but are still, where there's still risk, and there's pretty much risk, some level of risk for all activities. It's just a question of how much. I think waivers are a good idea. They're not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination, but a good liability waiver, especially one that sort of works in both directions, where the person who's choosing, let's say this is something that's come up with something I've helped someone with before. Let's say you're a fitness trainer and you're doing, let's say, which is permitted now, let's say you're doing outdoors fitness training with, like say doing it in a park or something. I would highly recommend somebody like that, and probably should do a waiver anyway for other types of liability from injury, but to make sure that there's a provision in there regarding this person is aware that there's a risk of exposure to COVID from this activity. They are choosing to participate in this activity, fully aware of that risk, and they're also, and I say two-way because they're also going to say in that waiver that they have, to their knowledge, not been exposed to COVID, that they don't currently have COVID, that they're taking, reasonable precautions in line with CDC recommendations to avoid getting COVID. Again, it's not foolproof, but at least if later on somebody participates in your event and they already knew they had COVID, and there's going to be more liability for them and less for you. You've at least made a reasonable effort to make sure nobody participating is participating knowing that they may be at increased risk of being a COVID carrier. So I think that's a very good idea and something that I would recommend everyone do until we're past this.
So you mentioned it's not foolproof. What could conceivably happen if someone contracted COVID at an event or an establishment? I
would say the most important thing is that the establishment and event be legal, and the fact that it's allowed. I think the combination of it being allowed under the regulations that exist at the time, them signing the waiver and you being able to show that you know, made the activity as safe as possible. And there's pretty obvious things, you know, to do. You know, even just things like having
temperature checks.
Yeah, and some of these things, you know, temperature checks may not be feasible for every small event. You know, you go to the Apple store and they do temperature checks. Not every business you go into has the budget to do that, probably. But, you know, just things like having hand sanitizer widely available, making sure, you know, certainly making sure people are not sharing, you know, foods and you know, or joints. Yeah. One thing I suggested, this was one of the last events that was probably legal pre-pandemic that I was involved with, was one suggestion I had if they wanted to participate with the event when it was still legal, to be clear, was to make sure that any, say, like pipe ends or anything like that had single serving covers. It's frankly probably something that should be a permanent addition to our society, because there's other diseases in the world than COVID. But yeah, things like that, just making sure that at least like the most sort of basic protections are in place. Now it's tricky because there's a level of economic feasibility. You know, I mean, you can't, if you reach a point where like the cost of putting on an event to make it as safe as to make it perfectly safe, make the event economically unviable, you're going to have to assess whether you just want to cancel it or to, you know, go to a reduced level of precautions that you still think are adequate. But I mean, there's just a level of, you have to find that balance, because, you know,
that's the point.
There's no point in
expect events actually to be more expensive, especially if they've had to curtail the amount of people they would normally have. Then,
and with these precautions,
the buck passes on to the purchaser of this service or experience.
And I think that's in a lot of cases why things are being closed or canceled. Like, and I don't always necessarily think it's the right decision. Sometimes I do. Like what we've seen with like something that's happened like in the last day with like college football leagues deciding where to play. And it's clearly like, they won't say it, but it's clearly an economic calculus where they're looking at risk of liability from lawsuits. They're looking at the cost of the additional precautions they'd have to take. And they're looking at the fact that they're going to have way less revenues than they would normally have from doing this, because they're not going to be able to have any fans for obvious reasons, especially in places like California with the regulations where they are. And, you know, I don't necessarily agree with it, but like they're making an economic decision that when you add in these additional costs and these additional risks versus the reduced revenue, it's not worth it. Now it's
an event killer for sure.
So sometimes it's not as simple as like, oh, we can't do this. It's just like, we could do this, but between the costs and the risk, it's just no longer worth it.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes the balance you have to try to find.
Well, I have hope in the ingenuity, especially for those that use cannabis. It tends to be, you know, a mind-expanding catalyst. And I think we will evolve, and there will be new kinds of experiences that have COVID consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, my belief is there's usually solutions. It's just a question of whether those solutions, you can get government approval for them, and are they economically viable? And also, can you convince the public that that's something that they feel comfortable doing? But they're, you know.
Yeah, or maybe it just results in a lot more private.
I mean, there's ways to make things work. Mm-hmm. It's just a question of whether it's cost effective and worth doing. But like, there are ways, if the incentives are in place, I always believe there's solutions out there that can be found.
Me too, and it'll be interesting to see how all of this unfolds.
And hopefully the science, you know, clearly, I think at this point, the solution to this is probably going to come from science, not from politicians. I think it's fair to say, at least not in this country. So I think hopefully the science will save us, even if our leaders are not doing a great job of doing so.
And what about international travel? I know that there are some travel advisories right now. It's not advisable, but how do you see the future?
So as I was saying before, with regards to like, obviously check whatever state you're in, and also be aware of the fact that it's still, until that hopefully changes, it's still federally illegal with regards to interstate. But with regard, I think the most important thing, let's say in an ideal world, which I think is very realistic, let's say 5-10 years from now, we're post-COVID and cannabis is at least federally decriminalized, if not fully legalized in the U.S. What I think some people need to be very careful about is to remember that even when we hopefully reach that point and people start to really get, I think it's something that's already happening in this state where people get, more relaxed and more loose and not as worried about, if I have a joint in the car, something horrible is going to happen. If I've got a joint in my pocket, something horrible is going to happen. But just remember,
I have a joint in the car.
Just remember that even if we reach a day, hopefully in the future in the U.S., where cannabis is, as it should be, in my opinion, something that's treated, like a legal, safe product for adults that is, no more subject to criminal prohibition than alcohol is, that's probably not going to be the case globally. And there's still many countries, and not always the sort of quote unquote very, dictator, totalitarian countries that sort of people obviously think of. It's not just like the North Koreas or the Saudi Arabias. There are countries that are, fairly, in some cases, fairly democratic that people travel to that still have very, very tight restrictions on cannabis and very tough criminal penalties for cannabis, unfortunately. So if you're any country you're traveling to, especially like outside of, Western Europe and a couple other places, like anytime you're going outside of like places like that, just research the laws and make sure that you're not going, just err on the safe side. Like we all love cannabis, but it is not worth ending up in prison in a foreign country over.
Or in some cases, it can be a life or death decision.
Yeah, exactly.
Not to be taken lightly.
No.
As comfortable
in the Philippines, they will.
As casual as we've gotten with our usage.
In the Philippines, like people get killed for selling drugs, so it's not something, including cannabis. So it's not something that. You want to be careful. Now, you can also exercise your own judgment about whether those are countries you want to travel to altogether. But if you do decide to travel to those countries, just make sure you know the rules. And if it's not safe to consume cannabis, wait till you get home.
Yeah. And you can do it.
And if you need cannabis for medical, as many people do, then avoid those countries.
Yes.
If at all possible.
Great advice. Really great advice. And I wanted to add, when traveling between states in the United States, NORML actually has a really great resource on their website, state by state. Actually, when I travel to another state, I always consult that so I can make an informed decision as to whether or not I want to bring my cannabis with me.
NORML is always a great resource and also a great organization to support.
It is, yes. So that is spelled NORML.org, and it's very easy to look up. And I just love being informed. And if you still choose to take your cannabis, you can decide how you want to conceal it or leave it at home. And what's great is so many states are coming online. Some are still just medical, but some are recreational. But if you're going to a state where you can purchase some cannabis, maybe you just leave it out of your suitcase and you go and buy something.
That would be my legal advice, because anytime you're traveling, until the federal prohibition changes, anytime you're traveling across state lines, even between two states where cannabis is completely legal, say California and Nevada, for example, at the point at which you're crossing state lines, that is still legal. Now, I'm not saying that, having a couple joints in your trunk when you drive across to Vegas is probably the biggest risk of prosecution, but nonetheless, the safest, most legal thing to do is if you're going to Vegas, go to a dispensary when you get to Vegas. It's legal there too, and support those businesses.
Yeah. And that's part of that tourism culture. Is visit the dispensaries where you're going.
Exactly.
And
support the local businesses.
I think it's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today, John.
My pleasure.
Always informative. Thank you.